So open source vulnerability management has been, I'll use dumpster fire as the term. So pretty much everything that we've done in the open source vulnerability management space is repurposing legacy vulnerability management solutions that were intended
Mhm.
for general information technology purposes. So, this firewall has a vulnerability. Let's create a CVE. Let's publish it
Mhm.
on the NVD, and let's use that for vulnerability scanning solutions. Open source doesn't really work that way because there's just too much of it.
Welcome to the Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host and AppSec enthusiast and growth manager at Escape, an API discovery and security platform. Today, my guest is Kyle Kelly, tech lead for supply chain security research at SamGrab and the founder of CramHacks weekly newsletter. With a background in consulting and research, he specializes in supply chain security, using his expertise to shape the insights he shares. Through CramHacks, he empowers readers to take an active role in software security and deepen their understanding of supply chain vulnerabilities. Quick special announcement for the Elephant and AppSec. In November, we're hosting the first Elephant and AppSec virtual conference. Join us and hear from speakers who aren't afraid to share their strong opinions. But now, back to this episode. In this episode, Kyle shares when you should focus on open source versus commercial tools and why open source vulnerability management is, in his words, a dumpster fire. We explore whether open source versions of commercial tools are more trustworthy, and Kyle debunks the common theory that vulnerabilities persist simply because open source maintainers haven't fixed them yet. But that's not all. We'll also dive into Kyle's passion for malware analysis and hear about his experiences as a cyber creator, like the time he was banned from Reddit for sharing his work. Dive right in. Hi, Kyle. I'm super excited to have you on the podcast today. So thanks a lot for joining, and finding the time and coming to share your opinions. Because yes, we discussed, before. Yeah, you have a lot of opinions on a different topic, and I've been following, a little bit your newsletter as well, and LinkedIn too, because I think you've shared, some posts recently, related to your newsletter. And I think one of the discussions, that kind of took over, like there was a lot of interest, was about how the CISO influenced, purchasing decisions. And I think at the end, you also like post rewrote like people need, to stop buying products because the company, is good at selling it, and buy the product because it actually solves, the problem. And it's quite often, the echo that I hear, I think, as well, because I quite often discuss with application security engineers about like the tools that they're purchasing, and less with the sometimes CISOs as well. So I think in general, like problem solving is, super important, but it's hard to change the mindset, and it's yeah, not going to be, immediately. Like, how do you think, this, how does this mindset maybe challenge in some way the traditional approach of actually, buying commercial software, and maybe, if there is open source tool that solves actually the problem, that people should use that?
Yeah, I was just reading a LinkedIn post, ironically. I'm a big fan of LinkedIn. I
Okay.
used to be I used to be into Twitter or X, and it just never turned out well. I could post something that I was really proud of, really excited about, and there's just always so many negative Nancy's on that platform. Same deal with Reddit. I keep getting banned from Reddit, from subreddits, and I'm like, I'm just trying to talk about
Okay.
cybersecurity.
Why?
Uh, they either say that I'm just like posting ads to my newsletter, but they're blogs that I'm trying to, inform people about cybersecurity. So it's not like I'm
Yeah.
making money off of
I
it.
mean, in some way, I can totally relate, to that, because I also been banned from Reddit for ads.
Apparently, many
Same.
people have. I had no idea it was so common. And then when I got banned for the first time, I mentioned it to a few people who I know are like I would consider them influencers in the space. And they're like, "Oh, it's your first one. Congratulations."
Oh,
But yeah, LinkedIn, I seem to get a lot of good feedback, a lot of good discussion around, and people maintain a level of professionalism, so that's always nice. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, that post around the CISO product purchases, a lot of that stemmed from my experience as a consultant. I worked with at least 100, probably 200 or more financial institutions across the United States as a consultant, and oftentimes helping them with product decision or what's the best solution for the problem that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And the common situation was, oh well, my buddy down the street, he's also a CISO at another bank, and they use this. He says it's good, so that's top on the list. A CISO said it was good, and therefore it is now maybe our number one pick for the product. Um, but your problem might be very different than the problem that they had. Your staff might have a very different skill set than the skill set that their team has. And so the same product might not solve the problem as well as it did for them. And I find that applies in just like the whole marketing space. It's very rarely do you see a quote from a DevOps professional or a security engineer who says, this product enabled us to do XYZ and it improved our efficiency by X%. Similar to a resume, you want to have, what did you do? What was the effect, the impact, and the
Mm-hmm.
outcome? Whereas in the marketing space, for products, it seems to be a lot of CISO said that, this product is good because the problem is bad. It's like
Yeah.
you need to buy this vulnerability scanner because there's more vulnerabilities today than there were yesterday. Like okay, but how does the product help with that? Like what did it actually do that allows you to keep up with the
Yeah,
influx of
what's the
vulnerabilities?
algorithm? What's the algorithm behind it? Yeah, what's the technology, and is it actually good technology sometimes as well?
Yep.
A big question.
Exactly. But people are buying the products just because they see, oh, this is a well-known CISO. He's clearly a security leader. He may even have cybersecurity expert in his LinkedIn bio, as most people like to proclaim. And therefore, you trust him and you just buy whatever the heck he says is good. Uh, but also, a lot of that thought when writing that LinkedIn post also stemmed a lot from the recent discussion around CISOs purchasing products because maybe they're an advisor for the product or maybe they're an investor in the product. So there's a lot of unethical or questionably ethical scenarios happening right now in the VC investment and security leadership space.
Yeah, I think it's hard, when you're actually like invested your money to refrain yourself and be completely not, yeah, objective, because when you invest your money, you want to see return on this investment. So you're going to try, to push it to be. I
Yeah,
think, yeah, the motivation in itself is wrong. It's just the motivation is right. It's just hopefully that the product that people are investing in is actually that they are evaluating whether or not it brings value in the first place, which is
yeah. I kind of look at it as similar to talking about your kids. It's like you will always think that your kid is the best at everything, and you will try to speak their praises at every opportunity you can. Or my grandma thinks I'm like the smartest cybersecurity person on the planet, and I have to constantly tell her, Grandma, I cannot fix your printer. I'm not that smart. But fixing a printer, like if you can do that, like that's the one thing I will never
I
deal with.
I can.
Um, So yeah, naturally you're going to speak the praises of the product that you invested in because if you didn't believe in the product, you wouldn't have invested in it. Um, and maybe you're investing in it long term, but you want to promote it early on, and you speak about the potential as opposed to what can it do today. And so you're selling potential as opposed to actual problem solving, which another product today might actually be better at doing. But ironically, so in the CramHacks newsletter, I added a survey just to see what people were thinking, asking should CISOs be able to invest in products that are used by the organization, that they have control over purchase. Maybe they have the purchase power, or maybe just influenced by speaking to whoever has purchase power. And actually, zero respondents answered no, so saying that they
Hmm.
should absolutely not be able to invest. Uh, Most did say that there should be some regulation around it to prevent some of the unethical conversations that
Yeah,
are
for sure.
out there today. But I was surprised that nobody said no, because I tend to be a hard no, to be frank. Maybe because I am not in a position to be making purchasing decisions and investing, and so I don't, I can't feel the potential upside to it.
Hmm.
Uh, but I would
And
also just personally feel unethical, like profiting off of my decisions through my employer. So,
yeah, but I think it depends, who replied to this survey and who was motivated to reply to the survey. So I don't know. It depends who your main audience is. Maybe, you have a lot of actually CISOs rather than security researchers among your audience, and you'd be surprised. Yeah, that's why it's, not surprising. Personally, to be honest, I think it should be I think we should be able to make our decisions, but it should be regulated in a sense. I would not say like just do whatever you want, but yeah, this I would say more you can do it, but it should be like regulated and transparent. And at least if someone is supporting this company by investing for it, it should be transparent to show that this person is sitting, on a board of advisors, and like at least you can make, objective decision. Okay, should I invest in it or not, based on what this person is saying, which is not always easy. Like on some, CISOs you see, okay, they've been early investors, on CrowdStrike, and for sure now, yeah. So, but sometimes I'm not 100% sure. Do you think that uh, people should actually only invest in and research, on the commercial software, or should we also like focus, on open source?
oh, I would love if companies would invest more in open source. It's that's
Mm,
especially on the supply chain space.
okay.
There's a lot of discussion around, hey, we want software integrity and we want SBOMs produced for all open source dependencies. And they want
Yeah.
open source maintainers to do all this extra stuff so that enterprises can feel more secure. It's like, hey, it is open source, right? Like you guys as the users of the project, you're more than willing to contribute and add these additional capabilities that you're looking for. If you want software integrity, like you're more than welcome to help us build that because it's open source and anybody can contribute. So I've been a big uh, opponent against saying like all open source projects need to create SBOMs and make them publicly available. Like, no, an SBOM is something that can be
Mm,
generated programmatically. If you
programmatic.
care so
Yeah.
much to have one, you can generate it yourself, or you can outsource it to somebody who's willing to do it for you. But don't put
Mm,
that on the shoulders of the open source maintainers because they have enough going on.
yeah, and I think it's just unrealistic. It's who should be responsible. Like, should it be defined, at the beginning of the project, this responsibility, who should be responsible for that? And I think it depends kind of also, yeah, how many people, contribute in general, how many people, like how fast it updates, I guess, as well, right? And how strong the community sometimes can be. So I think one of the articles you that I saw, in the newsletter, is also like on managing vulnerabilities, in open source. So kind of right now, at least as what I've seen, many like security tools use the NVD, in the US as their sole source of, security advisories. But yeah, it's not always like there is no requirement to publish there. So what do you think about that? How companies actually should, resolve this problem of untracked vulnerabilities in open source? Because kind of, okay, there is a problem, but what should we do?
Yeah. So open source vulnerability management has been, uh, I'll use dumpster fire as the term. So pretty much everything that we've done in the open source vulnerability management space is repurposing legacy vulnerability management solutions that were intended
Okay.
for general information technology purposes. So, this firewall has a vulnerability. Let's create a CVE. Let's publish it
Mhm.
on the NVD, and let's use that for vulnerability scanning solutions. Um, so open source doesn't really work that way because there's just too much of it, and also there's the forks
Mhm.
of projects. There's well, most software dependencies are going to be open source, and so they're deeper into the applications or the projects, and so you can't just run a basic vulnerability scanner on it and find all the vulnerabilities. You need to do software composition analysis, and so something
Mhm.
like NVD or the CVE program as a whole has over 250,000 vulnerabilities in it. How many of those are
Okay.
actually impacting open source projects? Nobody actually knows because they don't label which ones impact open source projects. So we have databases such as the GitHub Security Advisory database, which does its best to ingest all of the vulnerabilities from NVD and multiple other sources, and then deduplicates them, finds out which ones are impacting open source projects,
Mm.
issues them a GitHub Security Advisory ID to keep track of which ones are affecting open source projects. So in the GitHub Security Advisory database, there's roughly 20,000 reviewed vulnerabilities, reviewed
Okay.
and approved. So we're going from 250,000 to down to 20,000. Um, but then if we look at
This is
the
confirmation.
scope of what those 20,000 are impacting, open source is massive. Just looking at software dependencies, there's roughly 6 million unique packages. And for
Okay.
PyPy, there's roughly 10, 10 releases for every one unique package. So realistically, we're talking about potentially more than 60 million open source packages and roughly 20,000 known vulnerabilities. Does that
Okay.
sound like a good breadth of coverage for the open source space?
I
Uh,
mean, it does not. I think that's kind of overall, yeah, it's overall, conclusion, I would say. And I also saw like you put Aqua Researchers report there, like how they've tried, to solve this problem and track on their side, kind of invest different harvesting methods and track all the GitHub pull requests, all the commits. Do you think it's realistic if it's like outside of security research? Because yeah, they could have dedicated time to do that and everything, but outside of security research, would any of these methods work?
uh, that's a tough question. It's the AppSec that blog post is probably one of my favorites because it it's not just looking at a vulnerability is disclosed. It's saying there's a timeline for when a vulnerability gets disclosed. It's a somebody had to have found the vulnerability, then there would have had to been a pull request to patch the vulnerability,
Mhm.
then likely it was disclosed to the public. But there's gaps in between those steps. And so, for example, one of my hobbies lately has just been looking at pull requests, or uh, maybe a project maintainer post a tweet or post on LinkedIn like, hey, there's going to be a vulnerability disclosed on Friday. I just go to that project and I look at the pull requests dating back for the last 2 weeks or so, and I sift through the code changes and I try to find the vulnerability. Because it's just kind of
Mhm.
a fun game to be able to say, I found the vulnerability before it was announced. But
So,
there's so many of those cases that
have you been
don't go
successful?
unannounced. Oh yeah, it's
Yeah.
shockingly easy in most cases because usually it they're not going to do like a full major release just because there's a vulnerability. Oftentimes it's just a bug fix, so it's very few lines of code that get changed. And especially lately with all the AI projects and ML projects, because people are working so fast, at least this is my assumption, people are working so fast and they're working on stuff that is so sophisticated that they don't take the time to care about the basics. So like a lot of just shell execution in Python scripts that very easily turn into command injection, or chatbots that
Yeah.
you can just add a semicolon and write a bash command, and now you have command injection. So, fascinating time to be alive.
So you think, yes. So you think actually like the whole concept, of shift left of executing fast, deploying fast. I mean, even if it's open source and it's not really, developers for applications, but still like there is kind of should it be actually applied to the open source in some way? Because people are just deploying so fast, without maybe verification sometimes. In that sense, should there be someone dedicated for security in open source projects?
Dedicated is necessary. I'm a big fan of shift left, maybe because I haven't had to manage an AppSec program, and so I don't have
Maybe.
firsthand experience dealing with a lot of the frustrations between security engineering and development. I've always just been somebody who cared a lot about security, and as I got into software development, I already had the background and like enjoyment of doing it in a secure way. But I do have a lot of software developer friends who are totally ignorant of security, and for them, I often do encourage and suggest kind of shift left type products, or even just like IDE integrations, so that as they're writing code, they can very nicely just get a little prompt that says, hey, this is likely not safe, and they can go, oh, that's pretty neat, I never thought of it that way. This little prompt is probably correct and I shouldn't do this. And then they can tell
Yeah.
all of their other software engineering friends and act like they're geniuses because they learned something about security.
Oh,
I have a
okay.
friend at a big tech company. They they never used any form of static analysis on their team, and he just started
Okay.
using an open source static analysis solution. And he found all these heap overflows and buffer overflows and memory issues, and he would point them out on his teammates' projects, and they thought he was the smartest person in the world just because he started using this really basic static code analysis solution.
Yeah. So you kind of feel also, like you've impacted someone else's life in a sense, I would say. And you mentioned like in the beginning, you've been a consultant before and now you're a security researcher. So I'm curious what made you, made this transition.
I like the security researcher role because, similar to consulting, I get to point out all the problems and I don't have to deal with them. Um,
That's a nice
that's the
way to put
honest.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. But really, I wanted to be more impactful at scale. Consulting, I was, working with a new organization on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, working on what I consider to be relatively basic problems. They're known issues. Weak passwords is a known security issue. Every organization has to deal with it.
Hmm.
Man-in-the-middle attacks, basic Active Directory misconfigurations, all these things. uh, it's out there. It's on the internet. If you care enough, you can find it. Whereas as a security researcher, I get to think about what is the problem of tomorrow, and can I be a kind of like a front runner or a leader in the space to find potential solutions to that problem at scale. So not just helping one organization solve a security issue, but how can I solve the world's security issue?
Mhm.
Especially
Okay. And what was the, yeah?
I was going to say, especially in the supply chain space, that's why I've been so fascinated by it. Is every organization
Hmm.
uses open source. I think the Linux
Yeah.
Foundation says 95% of orgs use open source software, and so my joke is that 5% lie. Um, but there's so if I can help people find issues in this open source software that they're using in their commercial products that are used by millions or billions of people, like that is a massive ROI uh, for the effort that I contribute.
Yeah, I mean for sure, and I think supply chain in general was as is becoming super hot topic, like literally here almost every week. about it from different people and actually open source as well. I mean, open source started at exit as that backdoor. I think since then it's like, yeah, so many conversations about it, to be honest, that I'm having. And that's why it's also like, yeah, supply chain as bomb as well. Like at RC, there were so many presentations, about it. And but yeah, maintaining it for open source is, as you mentioned, really hard. And I think one of the other topics that you've kind of discussed was, the difference between direct and transitive dependencies, about like how they impact vulnerability management in open source, and can you tell a little bit more, what's the difference for people who are listening?
So a direct vulnerability is one that's impacting a software dependency or package that you are directly utilizing in your code.
Mm,
So a good example might be the requests package in Python. If you want
okay.
to if you want to make a request to a website, you do request.get, and that's using the library to perform a function. Well, the request project that you're using also has its own dependencies. And
Mm,
so those would be transitive dependencies, aka indirect dependencies. And so when you use an open source uh, project or package in your code, you're not just using that code, you're using all the code used by its dependencies and its dependencies, and so on.
okay.
So I think it was a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, GitHub released the Octoverse report, and for a JavaScript project,
Mm,
they calculated how many total dependencies a project used if it used 10 direct dependencies, I believe it was, and it was something ridiculous. It was like if you use 10 direct dependencies, you wind up using uh, many more multiples of that. It was I, I want to say it was maybe even 100 dependencies. So if you're using 10 in your code, you wind up using 100 different projects code as well. Yeah.
okay. Wow. That's kind of impressive numbers. Like, do you on your own also like actually ever used, open source software or any dependencies to build something or maybe contributed to the open source project?
Yeah, I'm pretty lazy, so pretty much everything I do
Okay.
is from an open source project. So yeah, if somebody else has done it, I don't want to do it again. And so if there's a package for it, I'm going to use the package. It's even for my most of the code I'm writing is very hacky. It's just quick scripts for research purposes. It's very rarely going into production or being used by people other than myself or other
Mm,
researchers on my team. And so, but even then, I still find a hard time or have a hard time finding the right packages to use.
okay.
Like right now, so maybe you use ChatGPT to help you write code, and ChatGPT will recommend software dependencies or what.
Yep.
So in the code, it'll say import whatever package name. So when ChatGPT first came out, there was, or at least GPT-3, 3.5, it commonly hallucinated packages. It would just make up a name and it would say import some random string that didn't even
Hmm.
exist. So then people were trying to install packages that don't even exist, which was a good opportunity for adversaries to
Yeah.
host malicious packages. Um, but like even now with GPT-4 and 4.0 and all the other LLMs out there, they're they may recommend an actual solution, like an actual package that works, but that package maybe hasn't been maintained in 5 years or 10
Yep.
years. And so that's another problem I keep running into. The best alternative is what are people talking about on Stack Overflow? Or you can just manually search npm or PyPy, but npm has like 2.5, 3 million packages, and I mean, just go to npm and search Roblox, and you'll get a feel for why searching on npm is not feasible. It's just like 20,000 malicious samples.
Okay,
There's a lot.
because yeah, I can totally relate to that because I was guilty writing some parts of code with ChatGPT and like in JavaScript, and it recommended me some packages, and indeed they were not available, and I had to like search, and I did not really verify the ones that I chose for security. I mean, since it was for front end, a very simple app, it was not really required, to there was no sensitive data, passing through it or any or not internal application, so it should be fine. But like you don't always have also these recommendations, a reflex to check, like what you are adding into your code and using it, and but like how if you're let's say if you're a big company, that's something you can do, but if you're a startup or a smaller company, how do you think you should approach that? Because if you don't have you can't maybe afford sometimes any security tools, how should you make sure or try to be sure that what the open source packages that you're using are actually secure?
Yeah, it's a really tough problem because, like you mentioned, not everybody can afford Artifactory and afford the overhead to maintain Artifactory,
Mm,
and that's just the inventory what dependencies you're using. Now you need a effective software composition analysis tool
mm,
that actually looks for the vulnerabilities in them. Maybe you want reachability for prioritization.
mm,
The expenses add up very quickly. Um, so more often than not, what I recommend to people who at organizations where this hasn't been a big investment yet is just help educate developers on what dependencies to select in the first place. There's like the problem that I was just mentioning. Uh, Developers are making the problem worse because they don't have the 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 mindset that, hey, this package I'm using in my code is literally taking somebody else's code, putting it into my project, and I don't know what the heck is going on in there. Most people
yeah.
don't even look at the repositories of the open source dependencies they're using, and they definitely aren't looking at the transitive dependencies. And so, using well-maintained or packages with a strong reputation, there is actually, I believe, a framework now. I forget the name of it, but
Okay.
it's a framework designed to evaluate uh, dependencies based on reputational status. So it's yeah, does it have a decent amount of contributors? Has it had a merge in the last X amount of days? This is also the OpenSSF scorecard, which is relatively effective. Um, so it's I wouldn't say what I would say is don't look for the silver bullet. Just look for how you can reduce the risk to a reasonable level.
Mm,
You still want to be able to move fast. You're going to introduce risk by using open source dependencies. You're not going to solve that problem entirely. But if your developers are at least mindful of it and saying, hey, like if I'm going to use a package, it better be actively maintained because I don't want to have to replace it next week or next month or next year.
yeah.
Um, and so holding developers responsible for the code they write is a big factor.
Mm,
And there was a slip in my mind who did the research, but for Maven, I think it was JFrog. They assessed,
yeah.
or maybe it was Sonatype. Anyway, somebody did research on Maven projects or Java projects, and they found that for 96% of the vulnerable dependencies in the projects, uh, 96% of them had a fixed version available. So a lot of people like to say, oh, we have these vulnerabilities because the open source maintainers haven't fixed them yet. They're like, well, that research kind of disproved that theory.
Mm.
It's actually your fault. You just haven't updated the packages in a year. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, just put the blame on other person, and then it helps. Do you think like open source versions of the commercial tools is something more trustworthy because they're or not, or it's still
um,
trust by verify kind of?
yeah, it's tough. I would say it really comes down to, is it still being actively maintained? If they went fully into the commercial space and no longer going to maintain the open source version, they don't care about vulnerabilities people are reporting, then
Hmm.
yeah, like just because there's a fancy name attached to it doesn't mean it's going to be secure. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, but do you think using like open source, like some security companies in the space use open source, as a go-to-market motion, especially among newer startups? Like I've seen a lot, in yeah, I've seen actually like a lot of tools, and we at Escape will also use a partial like for GraphQL Armor library. Do you think it's something good to do, or if it's
it,
one shot and then not maintained again, like to the question of maintenance?
yeah, I think the risk there is all reputational for the the company. So like
Mm.
SemGrep, for example, did exactly that. Open source SemGrep is where most of our reputation comes from, and we've had I don't want to speak on behalf of SemGrep, but there's it's been a difficult time to express why the commercial product is more valuable than the open source project, or more valuable enough to convince you to pay for it. So in order to kind of express that difference greater, we had to invest more into the proprietary version. But we still
Mhm.
maintain the open source project because we know that's what has given us the reputation, and we don't want to lose that respect in a way. But also, it's
Yeah.
just great to. I think it's been great for me as a researcher at SemGrip. I really enjoy seeing how people are using open source SemGrip in unique ways. For example, I'm a big fan of malware analysis, although I've never done
Okay.
so professionally. It's more of just a hobby. But there are people who are using Ghidra to output uh, decompiled code from binaries, and then
Hmm.
they can use SemGrep to scan the decompiled code. So because SemGrep doesn't need code that can build or compile, it's very effective for hack together code that the decompiler spits out. And so I think that's beneficial to SendGrip as a company because we can see how people are using it for unintended purposes and maybe identify future product ideas.
Okay. And why are you a fan of the malware analysis?
I, really, why I love technology as a whole is you use it for whatever you want, and if you can use it for a
Okay.
way it's not intended to, that's really cool to me. So, malware is just really fascinating in the sense that it's well, I don't know how to say it without coming off the wrong way, but
Okay.
it's it's just really fun. I remember when I was in high school, my little brother used to play PlayStation in the living room, and I had a Wi-Fi adapter, and I would just like DDoS the TV, or I would DDoS our own home network and kick him off while he was playing Call of Duty, and just seeing his reaction was really fun. So,
Yeah, I mean, as long as he doesn't listen to that podcast, it's and remembering all of that,
well, it's funny because
it's
that
fine.
kind of introduced nobody really, unless you do it in like the worst timing. As long as you're doing it in a fun environment and a safe environment, pretty much everybody gets interested by it. Like my mom even would like hide behind the corner and giggle as I shut off his PlayStation, just because it's
Okay.
like fun. And then when my brother learns about it, like he's now interested in cybersecurity. He's like, "Can you show me how to do that? I want to know how you did that. Like, I didn't know that was possible." So same thing with malware. It's I did the same thing with my brother. I sent him a file. I told him it was hacks for a video game that he used to play. And when he
Hmm.
downloaded it, I turned on his webcam and was talking to him, and I was like sending him pictures of himself. And
Oh wow.
it
Okay.
I
So
would never
it's
do
like,
that.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
like
I
the
wouldn't do
biggest
it
scare.
maliciously.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
it's just for
yeah,
fun.
yeah. I mean, I have a cache cam on my laptop for exactly, that reason. Just some, yeah, so, someone like trying to kind of manipulate that. And what did inspire you, to start CramHacks?
CramHacks was actually, I was having career discussions with people at SemGrep, and one of those people was Clint Gibler of TLDRSec, so a very successful
Yeah.
cybersecurity newsletter, and he was kind of helping me figure out, what do I want to do 10 years from now? Why am I interested and excited about cybersecurity? A lot of thought-provoking questions, and eventually I came to the conclusion that I don't actually like to do work in cybersecurity. I just like to learn. I'm really
Okay.
fascinated by, I call things magic. So like SemGrep, to me, the first time I used it, I ran SemGrep and I had vulnerabilities, and I was like, that's magic. I need to
Okay.
figure out how the heck it's doing that. So then I learned a lot about static code analysis, and then I learned about like chain analysis and abstract syntax trees, and eventually you learn enough details that the magic kind of fades away. And so then I get interested about the next thing, like what else is magic to me, and how can I figure out how it works. Magicians, I'm the same way. Although I haven't gotten into magic myself, like with cards and
Hmm.
whatnot. I every time I see a magician, I have to Google how they did it. So like Penn and Teller, I'm a big fan
Okay.
because they're always trying to figure out how the magician did their trick.
Okay, so it's interesting. You want to know kind of the inner workings of of the things that you do not actually like maybe understand how they work, and at each time it happens, you kind of try to understand how it works. Like, what do you think would be the thing that you would maybe a year from now, not 10 years because, too far, but like a year from now, like what would do you think could be a thing that's interesting for you to, would be like interesting for you to explore the inner workings of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think something that I've always wanted to do more. I don't know if I'll ever be able to do so professionally, but I'm really fascinated by like neuroscience and psychology and kind of where those two fields connect. So I've read a lot of similar books. Actually, I have like the de facto neuroscience textbook. I've read like 5 pages of the 1500.
Okay.
Uh, but I kind of look at humans the same way I look at computers. It's really fascinating how our brains work. A lot of what I do with CramHacks and LinkedIn and social media is experimental. I just like to, for example, I've noticed that when I make a LinkedIn post on Sundays, they get way more impressions and interactions. My assumption is
Oh,
because there's less people posting on Sundays. And so my post stands out more than if it were to be during the week. Um, but that, like figuring out all those little nuanced tricks and why they work. I Next year or later down the road, I hope to spend more time with.
okay. I
And
mean, it is psychology, and maybe in the future there'll actually be, a role that's going to be called like like psychology or security science, where you're kind of trying to understand the behavior of, from one side, the attacker, from another side, maybe, I don't know, developer, or on it. Just, I think it's gonna be more probably on a larger scale, I would say, but I think there will be so many opportunities in the field, especially, with the development of artificial intelligence. And I think the whole industry is going to probably, be different 5 years from now. So it's very tough to say, like, where do you want to be, 10 years from now? I don't know, but
yeah,
where I want to
I guess
be.
a more relevant answer to your question, I guess,
Yeah.
would be virtual reality. I think is going to get really interesting, or
Mm.
augmented reality. I'm more of a fan of augmented than virtual, but I think it's going to
Okay.
introduce a lot of unknown risks, and people are
Mm.
going to maybe get too embedded into augmented reality or virtual reality, and there's going to be unintended consequences, like AI. Every technology will have unintended consequences. But my biggest pet peeve is security concerns and things like that, limiting the advancement of humankind. It bothers me so much. It's like we can't have nuclear reactors for nuclear energy because, well, somebody's going to turn it into a bomb. And like, okay, yes, that did happen, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean we just stop using nuclear energy forever. It's the cleanest form of energy. Why wouldn't we use it? Um, and so that stuff bothers me a lot, and I think AI was kind of on the cusp of that. We've had AI for a long time,
Yeah.
and when ChatGPT came out, a lot of
But
people were concerned. Uh,
um,
but that can't be a limiting factor.
yeah. Yeah, I think most of the time people tend to see more negatives than positives. That's why like immediately it goes, to the extreme lengths. For sure. And speaking, about the future, there's a question I always ask on the podcast. What advice would you give to, younger generation who start in security, in application security?
I would say talk to as many people as you can. Uh, So, like I mentioned, I have not ran or managed an AppSec program. I don't have a lot of the first-hand experiences, but I talk to so many people that do and have. And so I like to get my experiences through third parties. One, it's a lot more efficient. One of my coworkers, when I was working as a consultant, he had over 50 years of banking experience. So
Okay.
our 2 hour long car rides were my absolute favorite because in 2 hours I can learn 10 years of banking experience. Um, and I don't have to live all those mistakes
Yeah.
and scenarios myself. I think there are some scenarios where you just have to learn by doing it yourself, but the more you can learn from other people's mistakes, the better off you'll be, and also successes. Not to, you just
Oh.
mentioned that we focus on negatives, and that's exactly what I'm doing.
I mean, learning from others' mistakes is definitely probably one of the really good ways, safe ways to do anything. I think yeah, when it comes to practical knowledge, I think probably we tend to keep in our heads our own mistakes for sure. At least, I mean, it depends on the personality, but it's more, it's more kind of the case. And what book would you recommend to anyone to read? Because you mentioned the one about neuropsychology, but what other book would you recommend? Like if you have to pick one, which one would you recommend anyone to read?
Um, Cybersecurity wise, this is how they tell me the world ends is
Hmm.
like by far my favorite book just because it's so relevant to today and talks a lot about Pegasus spyware, talks a lot about the exploit trade
Hmm.
space, or um, a lot of Snowden, a lot of just like government involvement in cybersecurity.
Okay.
Very fascinating. The book that I always recommend to people, because it was recommended to me at once, and I think it changed my life, is it's called Solving for Happy, and
Okay.
that's more of a, I'll call it a self-help book, but it's just really interesting to put life into perspective. So Solving for Happy, it kind of breaks up into if you're sad, it's likely because you're regretful and thinking about the past. If you're anxious, it's because you're likely thinking about the future.
Hmm.
Very rarely do we live in the present and just ignore the anxiety and the sadness and just actually live. So that's what I try to think about on a daily
Yeah.
basis.
It's hard. Like another really good book for that. I don't know if you heard about it. It's called Power of Now. It's
Yep.
kind of, yeah, on a similar topic, and but it's really tough to implement. Like I read it, yeah, some time ago, but it's been hard to do, to implement that. Okay, well, thank you so much, Kyle, for yeah coming on the podcast. It was a really interesting conversation, and thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts and opinions. And I would be very excited to see where you end up in 1 year, 5 years, and 10 years from now, like where your curiosity brings you. So yeah, it was very fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah. Appreciate you having me.